Francois-Noël Babeuf, also known as Gracchus, a nickname given to him in homage to the Gracchi brothers of ancient Rome, could be considered among the first revolutionary socialists. Babeuf, born in Picardy, France, in the year 1760, was a hard-working manual laborer who provided for his family through the sweat of his brow. Babeuf was ahead of his time, radically left-wing, even by Jacobin standards, fighting not only for legal equality, but economic equality as well. He was an advocate of the abolition of private property, universal suffrage, equal land redistribution, and equal wealth and income distribution as well. In 1787, he took up writing and journalism, and in 1789 was briefly arrested and imprisoned because of articles that he wrote and published advocating for tax reform. After he was released from jail, he went on to found his own news journal and would regularly publish articles agitating for his ideas. Following the execution of Robespierre in 1794, he was an avid defender of the politicians who had instigated and perpetrated the Reign of Terror, objecting to the violence itself, of course, while at the same time doubling down on the French Revolution and standing against the Thermidorian reaction and the revenge killings carried out during the White Terror. Through and through, he was an advocate of the revolution. One could even call him the original tanky. With the overturning of the old Constitution of 1793, the nature of the new regime began to reveal itself, as the old ruling class had been replaced by a new one. And thus, the interests of the political elites within the Directory began to diverge from the grassroots populism of the revolution. The well-off stayed rich, and the poor remained poor. And in lieu of this, Babeuf launched a newspaper titled The People's Tribune, where he would criticize the moderate and right-wing elements of the revolution as well as the Thermidorian reaction following the terror. Babeuf would once again be jailed in 1795 for his polemics. While in jail, Babeuf would be put in contact with other prominent agitators whom found themselves in the same situation for similar reasons. From Italian immigrant and socialist writer Filippo Buonarroti to the French poet Sylvain Marechal, Buonarroti was an open supporter of the French Revolution back in Italy and had joined the Jacobin Club in 1791. He was a friend to the Bonaparte family and wrote a number of texts that would go on to influence the revolutionary thinkers Marx, Blanqui, and Bakunin. Buonarroti was a mutualist, believing that society developed in stages, starting with monarchy, then going on to liberalism, then radicalism, and finally socialism. Sounds pretty similar to historical materialism, if you ask me. Marechal, on the other hand, was a poet, political theorist, and philosopher whom had a vision of a golden age for humanity. Marechal was an atheist and an enthusiastic supporter of the French Revolution as well. He was a believer in a kind of agrarian socialism, where everybody would grow and share food communally and goods were distributed according to need. Jail acted as fertile recruiting grounds for Babeuf to form his clique, and after he and his colleagues would be released, they would go on to join the Pantheon Club. The Pantheon Club was a group of political radicals consisting of terrorists, Masons, Montenegrins, and socialists. Gracchus Babeuf and his colleagues castigated the wealthy opportunists whom benefited from the revolution at the expense of the peasantry and the proletariat, and stood juxtaposed to the monarchists, moderates, and liberals in the assembly. As France's economic crisis deepened, as poverty set in and war bonds went unpaid, Babeuf grew to prominence through his socialist agitation, which the Directory tolerated as to provide an outlet for mass discontent without people defecting to the Royalists. As a consequence, however, Gracchus grew to prominence, and the Pantheon Club swelled in size from 900 members in November of 1795 up to 2,400 members in February 1796, until the club would be forcibly dissolved by Napoleon Bonaparte on the order of the Directory. Despite the dissolution of the club, however, the conspiracy of the equals would persist. Babeuf and the other socialists would remain tightly organized within the Directory and assemble in secret, consolidating and centralizing their power and influence and political ties in a plot to ferment a coup. Following up in April, a placard titled Analyse de la Doctrine de Babeuf, or Analysis of the Doctrine of Babeuf, were scattered all across Paris. Within the placard contained the kernel of thought of the earliest socialist thinkers on record. Quote, "In a real society there should be neither rich nor poor. The rich who don't renounce their excess in favor of the indignant are the enemies of the people. The goal of the revolution is to destroy inequality and restore common happiness. The justice of this principle flows from the proofs of Article 1 to 3 above. But what do we mean by community of labor? Do we want all citizens to be forced to do the same work? No, but we want all the different labors to be shared that no able-bodied individual is idle. We want the increase in the number of workers to guarantee public abundance. We want it to be that in return each receive from the fatherland all he needs to meet his natural needs, as well as those artificial needs which all can satisfy. The Constitution of 1793 is the true Constitution of the French, for the people solemnly accepted it, because the Convention did not have the right to change it, because in order to arrive at this, they shot down the people who demanded its fulfillment, because it chased and killed those deputies who did their duty in defending it, because terror against the people and the influence of the emigrants presided over the writings and the acceptance of the Constitution of 1795, which didn't even receive a quarter of the votes that of 1793, because the Constitution of 1793 consecrated the inalienable rights of each citizen to consent to laws, to exercise political rights, to assemble, to demand that which it considers useful, to be educated and not to die of hunger, rights in which the Counter-Revolutionary Act of 1795 openly and completely violated. And with that final call to action at the end of the placard to restore the democratic constitution of 1793, the popularity of Babeuf's fabled song titled Dying of Hunger, Dying of Cold spread like wildfire and was sung aloud by all those whom dwelled in the bars and the streets and the other places of popular gathering within Paris that night. Rumor had spread within the following weeks that the new government was bankrupt. This news, in tandem with the fact that many within the lowest classes were poor and in dire need of relief, sparked a popular surge in socialism and Babeuf's ideas. This, on top of the fact that these ideas had now caught wind amongst discontent soldiers within the French military, created a popular and military base for the conspiracy of the equals. At last we arrive at the conspiracy of the equals, or an attempted coup d'etat by the most radical components of the Jacobins. The call for another revolution was proclaimed loud in the air across the streets of Paris as the members of the military and the police, as well as the socialist revolutionaries, attempted to stoke the fire for another uprising and the establishment of a French socialist republic. Sylvain Marechal published a manifesto titled The Manifesto of Equals, which was a call to action against the new regime, taking the original ideas that the First Revolution was based off of to their final conclusions, as the First French Revolution was failing to deliver on its promises. For 15 centuries you lived as slaves and consequentially unhappy. For the last 6 years you barely breathe, waiting for independence, freedom, and equality. Equality, the first wish of nature, the first need of man, the first bond of all legitimate association. People of France, you are not more blessed than the other nations that vegetate on this unfortunate globe. Everywhere and at all times the poor human race, delivered over to more or less deft cannibals, served as a plaything for all ambitions, as prey for all tyrannies. Everywhere and at all times men were lulled with beautiful words. At no time and in no place was the thing itself ever obtained along the way. From the time immemorial they hypocritically repeat to us, all men are created equal, and from time immemorial the most degrading and monstrous inequality insolently weighs upon the human race. As long as there have been human societies, the most beautiful of humanity's privileges have been recognized without contradiction, but was only once put in practice. Equality was nothing but a beautiful and sterile legal fiction. And now that it is called for with an even stronger voice, the answer is, be quiet, you wretches. Real equality is nothing but a chimera. Be satisfied with conditional equality. You're all equal before law. What more do you want, filthy rabble? Legislators, rulers, rich landowners, it is now your turn to listen. Are we not all equal? This principle remains uncontested because unless touched by insanity, one can't seriously say it is night when it is day. Well then, we aspire to live and die equal, the way we were born. We want equality or death. This is what we need. And we'll have this real equality, at whatever the cost. Woe unto those who stand between it and us. Woe unto those who resist a wish so firmly expressed. The French Revolution is nothing but the precursor of another revolution, one that is greater, more solemn, and will be the last. The people marched over the bodies of kings and priests who were in league against it. It will do the same to those new tyrants, the new political tardifs seated in place of the old. What do we need besides equality of rights? We need not only that equality of rights written into the Declaration of the Right of Man and Citizen, we want it in our midst, under the roofs of our houses. We can sense everything for it, to make a clean slate so that we hold to it alone. Let all of the arts perish, if need be, as long as real equality remains. The agrarian law, or the partitioning of land, was the spontaneous demand of some unprincipled soldiers of some towns moved more by their instincts than by reason. We lean towards something more sublime and more just. The common good or the community of property. No more individual property in land. The land belongs to no one. We demand, we want, the common enjoyment of all of the fruits of the land. The fruits belong to all. We declare that we can no longer put up with the fact that the great majority work and sweat for the smallest of minorities. Long enough, and for too long, less than 1 million individuals have disposed of that which belongs to 20 million of their kind, their equals. Let it at last end, this great scandal that our descendants will never believe existed. Disappear at last, revolting distinctions between rich and poor, great and small, master and servants, rulers and ruled. The Manifesto never met unanimous support amongst the conspirators. However, the general ideas behind it very much reflected the sentiments of the socialist revolutionaries at the time. The people behind the conspiracy understood that absolute liberation could only come when people also had freedom not only of, but freedom from. Freedom from what, you might ask? Well, freedom from sickness, freedom from hunger, from unemployment, from exploitation, from lack of health care. In other words, economic freedom as well as political freedom. In the end, the Directory took notice of this active socialist instigation and burgeoning socialist movement and saw a rising threat to the new ruling class's hegemony, and with the help of Grégoire Birchall, a counter-revolutionary traitor within the ranks of the radical Jacobins, were able to uncover evidence of the conspiracy plot to overthrow the Directory on the 11th of May, 1796. 2 volumes worth of notes, leaflets, letters, and plans exchanged between the conspirators were unveiled by the Directory, which were used to prosecute Babeuf at his trial. In the end, the conspirators were arrested before they could carry out the coup, and Babeuf, despite being only one of several perpetrators of the conspiracy, was made an example of by the Directory and took the majority of the blame for the plot. Riots were incited in an effort to rescue the conspirators. However, they were quickly suppressed and dealt with by the army. On the 27th of May in 1797, Babeuf would be sentenced to death alongside his friend Augustin Alexandre Darth. Other prisoners involved in the plot would be deported, while the Montenegrins in their ranks would be acquitted of all charges. And what of his colleagues? Well, Sylvian Marechal would go on to write among the first works on women's studies and would be an open advocate for women's rights and gender egalitarianism until his untimely death in 1803. And Philippe Buonarroti's friendship with the Bonapartes would go on to pay off, as he would be released from jail and appointed to the prestigious position of First Consul, one of the most powerful positions in all of France. Grachi Babeuf and his colleagues were ahead of their time. They understood that the goals of the Enlightenment and what it actually took to fulfill those goals were fundamentally incompatible with the continued perpetuation of class society, and went on to organically form a well-disciplined, tightly knit, centralized, and well-organized vanguard party in the pursuit of their ends. And yet their rigid discipline and organizational tactics failed them in the end due to an internal security leak to the Directory. This, of course, was not the only reason that they failed. We, here in the 21st century, have a number of advantages over the French socialists of old. Unlike Babeuf and his colleagues back in their day, we leftists here in modern times have the benefit of hindsight, with over 200 years of history and theory behind us that we can look back on and analyze and learn from what our predecessors did right and what they did wrong. Babeuf and his fellow conspirators in the Directory had no such benefit, and were very much political pioneers journeying into untouched territory up to that point. In addition to the lack of hindsight, Babeuf had a weak theoretical ground as well. For example, he had no conceptualization between the difference between a bourgeois democratic revolution, such as the one his country was enduring, and a socialist revolution akin to the October Revolution in Russia. He did not understand how the task that he was undertaking was very much premature. France at the time simply was not capable of skipping capitalism and going straight to socialism like the Soviets were, since the productive forces and conceptualization of political economy were simply not advanced enough to do so. All Babeuf believed in was the revolution itself, and that the revolution should be fought for and carried out and brought forth to its logical conclusion. And so concludes the story of Babeuf, a man whose legacy echoes beyond the grave to this very day. A man who has influenced and inspired dozens of philosophers and revolutionaries throughout the centuries. And were it not for the important work that he did while he was alive, it would have been a great while longer before we would have other gems emerge of the likes of Marx and Engels. Needless to say, the takeaway is this. No matter how bad things get, no matter the odds, we must always fight for what is right. For the actions that we take today, no matter how light they may seem, will carry the weight of Mount Everest, as future men and women of noble heart and mind will inevitably rise to the occasion to expand upon our rocks.